so I wanted to look into how does the department train and select leaders? How do we do, and how can we do sort of leadership development better? But what I found as I started looking into that more was that it was very difficult to find disaggregated demographic information at the time when I began collecting data, so 2019, 2020. But what was available to me started to point to a really stark lack of diversity in senior leadership positions in the department. And Black women seem to be one of the least represented minority groups, so minority amongst minorities. And I became very curious as to why. And so my dissertation is a result of following that thread. And I also would like to say up front that I know there are a lot of Black women FSOs and others as well who have had very challenging experiences in the Foreign Service and have struggled to advance to more senior leadership positions. And I spoke with many of them over the course of my research. And in my brief presentation today, I'll acknowledge and point out those disparities and barriers to advancement that I discovered in my research, but I also will point to potential ways forward. I'm by nature a very positive person, and I look for the silver lining and opportunity in every situation, including challenges. And so when Yolanda asked me if I would share my research, I was super excited to do so, but told her that I also wanted to leave folks hopeful, especially the Black women FSOs who stay with the department. So I hope you leave our time here today feeling positive about, looking for and hopefully finding open doors in your Foreign Service career. And so with that, I will kind of share my screen here, and we'll jump right into a sort of an overview of the research, my findings, a summary, some recommendations, and then Q&A. So my goal is to not spend too much time talking so that there's more time for questions. Okay, here we go. All right. So just to tell you a little bit about the research itself, it was a KMO analysis was what I used, which is we call a gap analysis. So I looked at what were the things that were lacking in terms of knowledge of Black women FSOs, mid-level Black women FSOs, motivation, and then organizational factors. And the purpose of this was to sort of find out what were the root causes that were impeding these mid-level Black women FSOs from getting to senior leadership positions. And then, there's a little bit of data here that we all know and has been shared throughout the department, I think, as well as the importance of diversity and how it contributes to more innovative leadership. But I was very sad to see the very small number of Black women FSOs, at least in 2020 data, of making up only 2% of the 37% of women in senior leadership positions. And so the data methods that I used were mixed methods, so quantitative and qualitative, survey, document analysis, and interviews. And to talk a little bit about the participants, before I get into that, I do want to share just a little bit of background about the US workforce that I think is really interesting. So despite making up 12.7% of the US population and having a labor participation rate that is much higher than other women, so 60.5% for Black women compared to 56.8% for white women, Black women only hold 1.6% of VP roles and only 1.4% of C-suite positions. And this is reflected in the Foreign Service as well, as you can see with the data I showed on the previous slide. So from entry level to C-suite, we see Black women falling further and further behind, and the representation actually drops off roughly 85% between entry level and C-suite positions. And we see a similar drop off in the Foreign Service from entry level to senior level positions. And also of interest, less than 10% of organizations actually set representation targets for gender and race combined. So most organizations will set targets for getting a certain number of women or getting a certain number of employees of color, but it's very rare that they look to combine the two, so the gender and the race, which would be very useful for strategically helping Black women advance. And one other stat I'll give is for every 100 men, this is the US Labor Department, for every 100 men promoted to manager positions, only 58 Black women are promoted, despite asking for promotions at the same rate as men. And for every 100 men hired, only 64 Black women are hired into manager roles. So there are fewer women, even Black women, even eligible for promotion at each level which widens the representation gap. And this is mirrored from corporate America. We see that in the Foreign Service. And something very interesting too, if we start from 2016 back, there were 4,600 ambassadors in US history, but only 9% of those were women. And the number gets even tinier if we look for Black women. And so if we look at our participant data here, and a lot of this comes from the 2019-2023 Department of State 5-year workforce plan, and then a lot of Government Accountability Office data. And so you can see a little bit, at this time of this data, the distribution by race of FSOs were 81% of FSOs were white, and 5.6% were Black, and 6.8% were Asian. And of those 35% that were women, FSOs, 9% were Black. And then sort of this lack of representation, I think, is an equity issue, because even though women represent 35% of senior leadership positions, Black women remain underrepresented at the senior levels with only 2% of those positions, despite being a larger percentage of the overall population. And so for this study, I focused on FSO1 and FSO2, Black women foreign service officers across all cones. All of the participants are self-identified as Black and self-identified as women. And the total eligible population at the time of the study was 86. So there were 86 Black women between FSO1 and FSO2 for FY21 data. And so there were 27 respondents that took the survey, but 17 actually completed and were eligible responses, which was about a 20.4% response rate. And then there were 14 volunteer interviews. And the cone proportions that you see here down at the bottom right are really proportionate to or commensurate with the overall stakeholder population, with PD being the largest percentage of where we have Black women officers and consular being the smallest. And the average years in service for the survey respondents was 19 and 16 for those who were interviewed. And 82% of the survey respondents and 73% of the folks who did interviews had a master's degree or higher. And this correlates with overall labor statistics for the United States that show that Black women are, by and large, of minority women, the most educated amongst minority women populations in the United States. And we'll go on to the next slide here. And so here you see a breakdown of all of the interview participants, their years in service education, their cone and grade. But what I found really interesting was 65% of the women that I interviewed are actually either Wrangell or Pickering Fellows. And so I don't have the specific data on this, even though I tried to look for it, but I would venture to say that the majority of the Black women who join the Foreign Service come in through the fellowship program. I'm not a fellow, but had I known, I would have liked to have taken advantage of the program. But I think that's really something that the department should think about in their recruitment efforts. Why is it that they are not also receiving more and more Black women that are outside of the fellowship pipeline? Because if, for example, that is what the department is relying on, and that knowledge is not as prominent at certain universities as others, then you lose out on a whole swath of population that could be potential foreign service officers. Okay, and so I want to talk about a little bit some of the key findings here and some of the gaps. But before I do that, I just want to share a little bit from the literature review for this study that I thought, a few points that I thought were really, really interesting. And one of them being sort of this double barrier of intersectionality that Black women face between gender and race. And when you think about leadership and you look at the leadership literature, research shows that really the whole foundation of leadership theory and how we think about leadership is based on male values. So from the start, male values determine who get promoted and what values are rewarded. On top of that, those male values in the United States in Western sense are based on white male values. So not only do you have to be have the characteristics that are often masculine or considered male, more male, to be associated with leadership, but then also what is associated with leadership is also race. And so Black women are likely to experience racism and discrimination at the same time, according to the research, as they try to advance to more senior leadership positions. And they're also twice as likely to experience microaggressions than white women and Black men in the workplace due to their sort of dual status. Another thing that came out in the literature is sort of how Black women face closed power networks. So if you look at like social network theory and other things in self-categorization theory, it tells us that people tend to associate with those who are similar to themselves. And this plays out in a lot of different ways in the foreign service context, mostly in how people socialize outside of the office, whether it's going to play golf or going to get drinks or whatever it happens to be. Those activities often happen amongst people that are similar. And it's in those social activities that the networking sometimes take place, that opportunities are discussed, and Black women are often left out of those networks and those circles. And so in the absence of gender diversity among senior leadership, women have lower levels of influence and interaction, and Black women even more so. And then lastly, I'll just say, in addition to that, the senior leaders in an organization really play a central role in the successful promotion and acceptance of diversity practices. So organizations such as the Department of State, we can have several policies put in place. But if senior leadership is not actively acting on those policies themselves from the positions in which they are, so overseas, that would be our chiefs of missions, our DCMs, our section heads, and back in the department, our DASs, our PDASs, et cetera, office directors, then the policies are less effective. So there has to be some effort put into ensuring that the senior leaders are the ones that are creating the climate in which those diversity policies actually will flourish. And this brings us to the gaps that I found. So when I looked at knowledge, there were a number of things to consider to see, okay, what is the issue that might be impeding Black women FSOs at the 01, 02 level from getting to more senior leadership positions? And there was only one knowledge gap, and it was a factual gap that kind of came across. And over 90% of the survey respondents and interviewees indicated that the promotion process to senior foreign service was not transparent. It was not easy to find the information. Many of them indicated they didn't understand how it worked, and they didn't understand how certain people seemed to be promoted who maybe didn't have the qualities that the precepts talked about. But what came out of that also was that when asked to list or identify what the promotion requirements were, less than 10% were able to do that. And so for me, I feel like that's a gap that shows that we really need to have a better understanding. There's some work to be done on the part of the FSOs as well to understand that process early on, even before you actually need to open your window, for example, so that you have the prep leading up to it. And then on the part of the department to help ensure that that information is transparent, easily accessible, and whatnot. And in regards to motivation, I was not at all surprised that all of 100% of the surveys and of the interviewees all showed confidence in their ability to lead. And many of them attributed this to having leadership responsibilities at a young age in their family. Either they had to take care of their siblings, or they had to start working early, or they had to take on other responsibilities for their family. So that sort of leadership became something that was a little bit innate. And so they felt really confident in their ability to succeed. The flip side of that is in the foreign service, the data shows that confidence decreases with time. So the confidence level was higher, the self-efficacy level was higher for FSO2 officers than it was for FSO1 officers. And in probing further in interviews, what I was able to tease out of that is that the continued microaggressions, the continued inability to advance, and barriers that they encounter slowly eats away at that self-efficacy as Black women advance through the system very slowly. And so by the time they get to a point where they might be at the level to go on to the senior foreign service, they've kind of lost a little bit of that confidence in thinking that is it even possible, because they've had to encounter so much to even get to the 02 or the 01 level. And then in regards to mentor sponsors and networks, everyone agreed, both survey respondents and interview respondents across the board, that having a diversity of mentors was important. So having mentors that were different grades, different experience levels, different race, different gender was important across the board. That wasn't a question. The issue came in sponsors. So everyone recognized that having sponsors was also important, but there was a lack of clear understanding of how to get a sponsor, and a recognition of not being in the circles where those sponsor relationships are made. And that connects to the networks and that sort of closed power circle of networks as well. And then finally, the organizational gaps. So these are factors that fall within the responsibility and the purview of the organization itself. And in the interviews, the surveys, as well as the document analysis, it was quite clear that the department had a number of leadership development training opportunities, whether they be online with other universities or through FSI. There are a number of them. What seems to be lacking is targeted development training opportunities that really focus on some of the issues that I mentioned previously that affect Black women and potentially other minorities. So this may be something that the department would want to look at, and it could be useful across the board, also for our majority colleagues, to understand these issues better. And then targeted policies to promote professional development. So there's quite a few new policies that have come out really since 2020, I feel like, and with the the creation of the Secretary's Office for Diversity and Inclusion, we really came through with lots of different policies and programs and champion things and lots of DEIA focused stuff to help. However, there hasn't been enough time or data yet to see that I had at my disposal at the time of the dissertation to see whether that is really being effective and whether those policies are targeted enough to help overcome some of the challenges for advancement for Black women FSOs. And then finally, the point that I kind of alluded to earlier about the importance of senior leadership sort of creating that diversity climate, which is an environment that is, ready and able to nurture the mentality and the mindset of the importance of diversity and what the various members of the team bring to the table, and to have that sort of inclusive culture. So this also includes senior level officers actively and proactively looking to have mentors that are different from themselves, to sponsor people that are different from themselves, and to provide those networking opportunities as well. And so some of the recommendations, I think, are, looking at how can we help increase the knowledge of the senior foreign service promotion requirements. When you look at currently the information, or at the time, it has improved a little bit, I think, that GTM has at sort of promotion and opening your window in the senior foreign service. It can be quite confusing. So if there is a way to streamline that information, if there's a way to have maybe an if-then checklist that people can look at to help guide them through, if I've already accomplished this, then here, if not, then here, is something that has shown to be very effective in helping to close knowledge gaps, factual knowledge gaps. And for motivation, being able to strengthen Black women foreign service officers' leadership self-efficacy. And this can happen in a number of ways, but I think one of the key ways to do this is to kind of eliminate a lot of the microaggressions as much as possible. And I think that goes into the organizational recommendation. So looking at our training and seeing that there's already quite a bit of professional development training, and trying to think about how can they be more targeted, maybe doing a training assessment to see exactly what kinds of trainings that we have that are targeted to the issues and the challenges that are being faced by Black women FSOs, and certainly surely by other minority groups as well. And then looking at how to make those a bit more targeted. And again, the same with policies for professional development. And, I think for the last one, to improve the diversity climate, I think there has to be something a little bit more drastic to take place. And I would actually propose tying financial and promotion incentives for senior foreign service to sponsorship and mentorship of a diverse group of individuals, and actually having those senior leaders have to have feedback from those mentees and sponsorees as part of the process to be considered for whether or not they're going to receive that incentive pay. It's very difficult, and the research shows that for these kinds of changes, these kind of culture changes, especially when it relates to diversity and it relates to pulling people away from this sort of social categorization theory of being with like-minded people, you have to put in place very strong incentives to encourage that, or either very strong rules and regulations to force it. I'm more in favor of the incentive mechanism as opposed to the forcing mechanism. I think we might have a more positive outcome. And those are my thoughts on that. And then kind of in summary, I think one of the things that really was, that came out to me that was very clear is that the most effective solutions will be found at the organization level, correcting the issues at the organization level, more so than looking at the knowledge or the motivation. We'll have more progress in trying to create some effectiveness at the organization level and addressing some of those things. For example, looking at the training resource misalignment, discriminatory practice and procedures, and diversity climate resistant culture, which is what I think we currently have at the department. And something that came across that was really interesting in one of the interviews I had, one of the ladies shared how she was in, I believe it was graduate school, and also of note, most of the women paid for additional outside training that is targeted to their needs. They have to go outside of the department and they self-pay. For example, I self-pay for my doctorate as well. So I think one of the things that she said that was very interesting in this outside program that she was paying for herself was that when it came time to have this unconscious bias or bias training, this particular program was focused for leaders of color. And so it was not focused, as it often is in the department, on recognizing bias, becoming aware of it, and changing your behaviors in light of that awareness. Instead, it was focused on the recipients of that bias and how they can best adjust, deal with, manage in that environment. And I thought that is such a good idea and would probably be very helpful for a lot of our colleagues to have that kind of a training. So I think as we're thinking at the organizational level, especially when we're thinking about our leadership development and trying to encourage more leaders of color, especially Black women, into leadership positions, think about some of those targeted issues of things that they face and how to incorporate that in training. And I think it could still be useful across the board to all of our colleagues, since of course our trainings are not, selective in that way. And then I think on the second bullet here, in regards to the motivation, is having a better understanding of those promotion requirements will be necessary, for career advancement. When you think about it, there's a lot of hand-holding that takes place, especially for folks when they come in with the fellowships during their first two tours, for example, as fast officers. There's a lot of connecting them with mentors. There's a lot of making sure that they understand the EER process and all of these things. But by the time you get to O2 and O1, a lot of that has dropped off, and it's really more self-directed and self-propelled, if you will. And the officers themselves have to look into learning and understanding these promotion requirements and figuring out for themselves, which is, appropriate given the leadership level that they're at. But I also think it could be useful to figure out how can we make that process a little bit more transparent and easier to follow as well. And then, of course, again, I think tying the sort of leaders and helping them to foster this diversity climate and to be more proactively seeking to mentor and sponsor foreign service officers of color and of just that are different from themselves, tying that to some kind of incentive would be very good. And so that is the bulk of what I wanted to share with you today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. and come back and have some time for questions.
Jackie, thank you very much for your presentation. We have several questions already in the Q&A, and we have questions that came to us also in our inbox, in the TLG inbox. I'd like to start with some of the questions that came to us before your presentation. You talked about the kinship and the mentorship that Pickering and Rangel fellows have. Like you, I am not a fellow also. I've been very fortunate to be sort of adopted into the fellowship family. But can you talk a little more about what you found with those who don't have that sort of ready-made network of sisters and brothers in the service to start with?
Absolutely. For those 5 folks, especially from the interview side, where I was able to delve into this a little bit more, that didn't have that, there was definitely more of a struggle, especially in the beginning of their mid-level career, and trying to figure out the assignments that they wanted and having people that they could reach out to either speak on their behalf or to give them guidance was much more challenging. So that's sort of a downside to that. An upside to it is that in the absence of that, several of them were able to have, of course, a smaller number, but a certain number at least of leaders and folks higher than themselves, not necessarily at the senior levels, that were not Black, who were able to kind of come alongside them in some of those cases. But there was definitely a sense of alienation and kind of in the water by themselves, finding their way. And I'll say for me personally, I actually didn't get connected to, I was the only person of color, Black woman, Black person at all of my first 3 posts, as far as officers, and I say my first 4 even on country team as well. Actually even, well, all of my posts, all of my posts, the only Black person on country team. But and you know, and it wasn't until my 4th post when I met Jacqueline Cole, who's an awesome officer, and at the time she was serving in Cape Verde, and she was the one who said, "Hey, you know, let's create this group and let's meet all these other women." And so from there, I was able to meet a ton of other women, mostly PD Cone, but it really took meeting one other woman of color to help make those connections and to have that sort of sounding board where you can bounce things off of when you're uncertain if something is as it should be in regards to the treatment that you're receiving or the difficulties that you might be having.
Again, we have several questions in the Q&A. We will get there. Before we go any further, I really want to again recognize and thank the senior Foreign Service women that we look up to. We mention your names and speak it with love often because you inspire us so much. We know that we have Ambassador Ruth Davis with us, Ambassador Brazil, Ambassador Alam Thomas, Ambassador Bridgewater, Ambassador Reddick, Ambassador Palashik, Ambassador Davis-Baugh. You inspire us so much, more than you can possibly imagine. And so we will speak your names as often as we need you to keep ourselves motivated. But also we frequently wonder how on earth you did it. I know that there was something else that's also floating in the Q&A that came in through TLG, and that's about the way to manage all of this career. Jackie and I, as I said before, were sister PAOs across the Congo River, she in Brazzaville, I in Kinshasa. We both actually were doctoral students at the time, self-funded doctoral programs as she spoke about, and both with young children. Jackie, can you talk a little bit about what you learned in your research about that family dynamic and managing to have it, quote unquote, have it all, or as close to having it all as possible?
Absolutely. And this is something I think that was quite powerful to me in speaking with the women. Just about all of them had some kind of family obligation, whether it was a spouse, children, or elder care. And or sometimes it was actually caring for siblings. Their income and their provision went more for just their immediate family. It even went for extended family. So there was that sort of added burden. But also in many cases for the women, finding their spouses able to find their place in whatever post that they were was a challenge. And some of them, spouses weren't able to come and join them for a number of reasons. And many times it was they were not offered employment, or they had applied for a job, but another person got it, yet it seemed like those were equal qualifications. So I think that the family component really impacts the ability, at least of the women that I encountered, to be able to actually be more active in those networking opportunities that often take place after hours. And during the time when most of the women are caregivers and have to be home with their children, many of them were single parenting because the spouse couldn't come or something like that. And so they had that extra burden of needing to be home and be with family, but also wanting to be able to build those networking opportunities. So I did see the sort of extra role of mother, of caregiver, playing into their ability to take advantage of some of the opportunities that would help with their career advancement.
Thank you. We're so honored to have with us the Director General of the Foreign Service and the Director of the Bureau of Global Talent Management, Ambassador Marcia Bernicat. Good morning, ma'am. We will give you an opportunity to speak here before we go to the several questions in the Q&A.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. And especially congratulations to Dr. Mourot, Jackie. Amazing work. We came very close to meeting each other in person today, but thanks to shutdown threats, a conference in Bangkok was pulled down. I was so looking forward to meeting you in person and hope to do so soon. If I could, I was making notes along as you were speaking and also thinking of a couple of things, but I'll start with a question you asked early on about why aren't more women of color, more people of color coming into the service through means other than the fellowships. And it's a question that was posed to me recently, and Yolanda and I have also talked about this. What I fear, if I can use that word, which I don't like to, is that the offer of the fellowship is such a strong incentive. And as we're recruiting people and we tell them about the fellowships, and again, across a wide range of people, they are wonderfully competitive for those fellowships. And so opt, I think, for very pragmatic reasons to try and come in through the fellowship route. What we don't have data on, but we're building a program to track recruiting in general, is how many people who do not succeed in coming in through the fellowship program then turn, or how can we turn them to be interested in coming in through a non-fellowship program. But quite frankly, if a fellowship program had been around when I was looking at graduate school, that's what I would have signed up for. So, I don't want to ever think of that program as a disincentive. It has been wonderfully powerful over the years in increasing our diversity. A couple of points. I wanted to go back because I looked carefully, but not thoroughly, at the promotion rates for the 23 cycle, because I was really curious to see how a number of our trends were going. Excuse me, and I wanted to say, so this is just for generalists, and generalists from 04 to 03 up through OC to MC. And I was struck by the fact that in every grade category, more women were promoted than men by the promotion boards. 56%, almost 57% to almost 30% from OC to MC, almost 35% compared to 23% 01 to OC, 14% to almost 10% 02 to 01, 21% compared to almost 17% at 03, 02. And at the 04 to 03 level, 61.5% of the promotees were women. So something's happening in the way those EERs are written, in the types of experiences that women writ large are getting, that the boards are seeing. So I was floored that it was so consistent in that way. A breakdown, just to give you a sense for African-American women, OC to MC, 16.7% of women were African-American. White women were 39.7%, Asian 64.3%, excuse me, of the numbers. Let me make sure I'm getting this right. 25% from O1 to OC were African-American women, 12% O2 to O1, almost 18% O3 to O2, and almost 45% O4 to O3. Kind of surprising, that last number, given how many more individuals of color we're bringing in to the service at the moment, and the high entrance rates of people through the fellowship program. I was really struck, Dr. Mourot, by your comments about your participants not understanding the promotion process to get into the senior service. We've put a lot of time and energy into hosting webinars, which we record, learning snacks, and cables. And I get it. Communicating and receiving information are both really hard today. But I would love your thoughts, particularly if you had specific recommendations from individuals about how else we can package this information. I like your checklist, so we'll certainly take that back. Everywhere I go in the groups that I talk to, I urge, especially our leaders and DEIA councils, to host watching parties for these videos. I think there's a real value for getting a group of people together and then letting them see and ask questions together. But we are absolutely, the Performance Evaluation Office would be happy to do a targeted webinar to any group, including women of color. Because particularly now that we're moving from the from the PDP to the CDP, excuse me, we can't over communicate enough. Although I will tell you, we had a very targeted effort last year, ideally focused on O2s and O3s even, who were interested in competing for chief of mission, principal officer, and DCM jobs. And the number of women in particular, and the people of color who put themselves forward for the cycle that's just ended, increased from the previous two cycles. So we think we're on the right track with communications. And again, pulling back if you will, pulling back the curtain on both those processes and the promotion processes. By the way, I always urge people to volunteer for promotion boards. If you want to understand how the EERs are read, you have two great ways of doing that: being on a panel and seeing how it's done. Secondly, we're really hoping that the fact that for the first time we release the scores that the individual board members, the average of the board members' scores for each of the precepts, will help people understand, again, how their EER was read and compared to others in their cohort. The boards read up to 5 EERs per person at a time, and those scores we hope will give people a real insight into something they may have thought they highlighted in a significant way, but that the boards did not read in the same way. On the point about mentors, I know the mentoring programs come and go, and there's also a really great mentoring program that our civil service colleagues have, and they open it to civil and foreign service. One of the biggest challenges is getting people to volunteer to be mentors, and you touched on that in the Q&A. It is hard and it is extra work if you do it properly, but that has been one of the biggest hurdles. If I could,
if I can just add,
oh, sorry.
If I could just quickly add a point to what you said there, Ambassador. I think something that was interesting too was the majority of women indicated that they preferred organic mentorship relationships. I think they understand that for the sponsorship, that kind of sometimes has to be someone putting someone together, but organic mentorship. So maybe it's more of encouraging supervisors, especially office directors, section heads, to take on those mentorship roles. That to really be a part of the job.
Well, and to your point, that's a really excellent point. We're also urging anyone who supervises that one of the ways they can demonstrate leadership is by speaking in their EERs, not only to the fact that they are, are managing their employees' work output and work product and learning how to do their tradecraft better, but also in looking at developing individualized development plans with their employees. In other words, also having conversations that are not about performance, but about how do you see yourself in the future? What are your goals? What do you need to get there? Giving people suggestions. That too is a part of what a good, not only a good leader, but a good supervisor should be doing. So we want to build that too into the EER process to be a recognizable factor that leads towards promotion. Next to the last point, our stay surveys and stay survey and all of the exit interviews we're doing underline the pressure of families that you noted. The largest number of people who leave are women, and among the women, women of color are leaving the department at a faster rate. Slow by any measure, even compared to most of our federal agency counterparts, but people inevitably cite being sandwiched between children and either taking care of parents or siblings or other extended family. Attrition rates for men and women are absolutely equal up to about the 10-year mark. And then from about 10 to 12 to 14 years, women are leaving us at a higher rate. After that, the attrition rate levels back off again, and we don't lose women faster than men. So clearly, and I love the fact that you brought in societal data as well. What's happening inside state is happening outside as well. Women are having still a much tougher time of managing things. Though I will add parenthetically that I became a single mother overseas, and I stayed out for 12 years, well, 8 of those years, because it helped me manage my family and my career a lot better overseas than I could have done back here in Washington. So I don't know that we are helping each other find those opportunities that allow us to manage family and careers better. And then the very last point I would make, and again, you touched on, the microaggressions or worse that that women and women of color are experiencing. And I just wanted to make a push for, we are in what we're calling the year of accountability. There are more tools than ever to hold people to account. But if people aren't reporting them, if they're not insisting on ways in which to have a dialogue with the individuals who are doing this, or to report them to be investigated and counseled and to get them to stop the behavior, I don't know how we're going to get to a better place. I suspect there will always be a need to develop resilience and to learn how to turn these experiences into teaching moments. Even if we were to eradicate all of that behavior inside the department, we will still face it with our foreign interlocutors, with the people we encounter from other agencies, certainly Congress and so forth. So I love the idea of training people how to deal with these instances as recipients of the instances. But I just want to emphasize that my goal, one of my goals, is to try to make our culture more focused on holding each other accountable, as well as our senior leaders. I didn't speak to your very excellent points that when it comes from the top, it works to change the organization much faster than when it's only coming from the grassroots up. But I would love to see people using the mechanisms we have, but also making it clear to one another that we expect a respectful workplace, that we expect respect from our colleagues, and we certainly don't want to put up with toxic work environments. And we're doing a lot of things like the manager support unit to get at that, but we can't get at those behaviors if they aren't being reported in a way that we can hold people to account. So went on a bit long there, but thank you so much for this session. Really invaluable.
Thank you.
Ambassador Bernicat, there's a question in the Q&A that I think you're best suited to answer. Are there plans underway to add additional demographic data, such as single parents, for example, to what the department collects and publishes? Family concerns impact employee availability hugely in the Foreign Service, and I don't think the data on this is being collected or considered, says the poster.
Yeah, well, we actually have the data, right? If someone's on your orders, we then have the data. The question is whether or not to collect other family information, you know, like are others dependent on you, either financially or emotionally or both. Some of that, you know, veers into privacy territory. But for example, someone asked us whether or not we could expand, just to give you an example, and Dr. Mourot, thank you so much for giving a nod to the number of policies that have changed. But someone asked us just this week whether or not we could expand the definition of tandem assignments. There are couples who have divorced and who have joint custody who try to serve together in order to keep the family together. And they've asked, can that be an expanded definition of tandemness? You know, again, hadn't thought of it, but really welcome these kinds of suggestions that get us to broaden our scope on how we consider these issues. So we'll definitely look into the demographic question.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions that are specific for you, Jackie, from the dissertation. And one of them is the elephant in the room, which is one, is there any data on Black female FSOs who leave the Foreign Service before making it to the senior Foreign Service? And then secondly, what did you find in your research about Black women FSOs and the open doors that they're looking for elsewhere outside of the department?
I would say for me, the information on both of those questions would be anecdotal. I did not come across data at that time that specifically looked at the number of Black women that were not remaining in the department if they didn't reach a senior position. I did, however, talk to a number of officers who knew of women who had left recently, most of whom had been in the department for at least 10 years. So I think that kind of piggybacks on what the DG was saying about the length of time and when you start seeing when women leave. And the second part of the question kind of on, what was the second part? I want to make sure I'm getting it correct.
The open doors and what it is that people are looking for when they are
outside of the department. Yes, I did. Several women talked about, you know, that there were a few that were really, you know, kind of getting to the end of their rope, if you will, and the kinds of experiences that they were having and the challenges that they were encountering, and were working on exit plans. So they were looking at having assignments in DC that allowed them to network with the private sector. They were looking at languages or fellowships that gave them a skill set that was going to make them more marketable, and factoring in, you know, the amount of time that they would have to work after that time to fulfill the requirement, of course. And they mostly were looking at private sector opportunities. They were not looking at staying with the government, and they were looking at returning to the United States.
Thank you. There's a question about the focus of your work, and that it focuses primarily on FSOs. And are you familiar with anyone who's undertaken a similar study when it comes to Foreign Service specialists?
I am not, although I agree that that would also be a very interesting study to look at, especially in some of the specialties where there's likely to be more difficulty for women to advance, such as NDS, for example, or perhaps some of our IT specialists potentially. I haven't looked at that data, so I'm not certain, but anecdotally, I would think of just thinking of larger global trends, labor trends. I will say that I do have a colleague that just completed her dissertation on the senior executive service, and her findings are very similar to mine. And we're actually working now on putting together an article for the Harvard Business Review. That, of course, we will have approved through the department first. But looking side by side at these issues that are being faced by women that are trying to advance in the senior executive service and in the senior foreign service across different agencies, because she's from a different federal agency.
Thank you. And thank you for that shout out for all of us who are academics who are publishing. Absolutely do get it cleared with the department, please. There are just, we are almost at time, but I just want to, a couple of quick things. There are lots of questions that sort of coalesce around, so what now, what next? When Jackie and I first talked about this session, we definitely wanted to leave our colleagues with the good news that, one, look, we are in a much better place in 2024 than our aunties and our big sisters were when they were coming through and blazing this path for us. That's the first thing. But what are next steps, Jackie?
I would say, from my perspective, definitely, I think one of the best things that we can do is starting with trying to build out our network. And it's great that we have the group amongst ourselves. And I think that's really good for that sort of, real talk and things of that nature that you might want to share. But the network needs to be broader and it needs to be bigger. And it needs to include a lot of people that don't look like you. And that's really important, not only for you personally to have a better understanding of, different dynamics and cultures and how things work within the organization, but it also allows you to meet people that have influence in rooms where you are not and who can speak on your behalf. So I would say if you're unable to do anything else, look for those opportunities to expand your network. Organize yourself so that once a month you can participate in one of those after hours activities. I think as I get older, I realize I'm actually a closet introvert, even though I do PD and have to be very extroverted. And sometimes after a full day of interacting with people, the last thing I want to do is go and interact with more people, especially if I have to do it for work and a reception. But I do make an effort to put myself in those situations where I know I'm going to be able to chat and meet with people that I wouldn't otherwise. And so I think we have to make a concerted effort to do that. And then I would say, the data shows that we are quite confident in our abilities. Transfer that to looking for sponsors. Be bold. Be bold. People are excited to talk about themselves. They are excited to know that you know something about them and their achievements and that you are interested in learning from them. So frame it like that. Reach out to people, whether you know them or not, shoot them an email, give them a call. If you know that there is a principal that's coming to your post, try to find time. If they're doing a coffee session or a listening session or a town hall, go and try to grab a couple minutes with them afterwards, introduce yourself and ask, I do that and I do it often. And it has never been a negative experience. So those are the two things that I would kind of encourage people to try to do. And I think that will help when it's time to do bidding. It's going to help. I was on the promotion boards summer 2022. So DG, right before we had the new process. So I'm very curious to see how the scoring plays out. But I was on the boards for management and political 03 to 02. And it's interesting how the experience that people bring from who they know, when they worked at a particular post, I remember doing some work at that post. And while I wasn't in the management section, I had a good colleague who was, and I know about that issue that they were working on, and that was really difficult. So this is a really strong statement, so expanding that network, I think and your sponsors and allies is probably one of the best things you can do if you don't do anything else.
I thank you for that. That is excellent advice. I too am a closet PD introvert. And I agree, at the end of the day, after having worked all day and fed the kids and all of that, going out to do one more thing is sometimes a little bit daunting, but do it anyway. I have to say also, I have never been met with anything but incredible kindness by ABAA members, really senior members. Here I am, I know exactly nothing, but when I approach them, they have always been so kind and just the ability to talk about anything. So I would really urge anyone who's thinking, oh, but they're just so lofty and they're so senior, do go ahead, make the appointment for coffee, say hi, introduce yourself. You would be surprised at just how warm and welcoming this really senior cadre of people are. And again, underscoring this piece about looking for people who don't look like you, so that you can have a much broader understanding of this organization. And here is where I will shamelessly plug the opportunity to serve on the next executive board of the Thursday Luncheon Group. We are looking forward to elections. Yes, this Renaissance slate has served almost 2 years. It may have felt like moments for you, but it felt like perhaps 20 years for us. We are very, very interested in making sure that the next group of folks who want to come, leave your mark on TLG and move our programs forward, that you are prepared to serve. So don't ignore those emails because they're not going to stop coming. They will be in your inbox. And also, please, please, please do not ignore the senior leadership, those who are still in service, those who are retired, who are eager to help us to navigate these spaces. They've been there before. We are not the first to marry in the Foreign Service. Some of us divorced in the Foreign Service, have kids, elder care, all of that. It will shock you to know that you're not the first to go through any of this, and it might be helpful to talk to folks who have navigated this successfully already. And with that, we are at time. Thank you for making the time to be with us. DG Bernicat, always so generous with your time. Thank you. I will again say to my sister, Jackie Mourot, Dr. Mourot, we were doctoral students at the same time across the river in the Congo. I'm so proud of you. And thank you, thank you, thank you for your work. Thank you all. This presentation is recorded.
Thank you.
We'll have it on TLG's YouTube channel. Goodbye, all.
Thank you.